All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for turning into this interview and checking out the IMES-MERIP Public Outreach page. My name is Nuhal Yazidi, and I work with the George Washington University Institute for Middle East Studies, and I am joined by
Shaddin Almasri.
Shaddin is a PhD candidate specializing in migration studies at Danube University Krems with a focus on the MENA region and East Africa. She is the recipient of the IMPOP Public Scholar Fellowship, and her piece focuses on nationality-based differentiation in the refugee response of Jordan. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. To get us started, can you provide just a broad overview of the main findings of your research and the main argument of your article on nationality-based differential treatment among refugees in Jordan?
Of course. So what I was looking at throughout the paper or throughout the article is a number of things. It was the idea was to look at this. It's part of a broader piece, of course, research that I'm concluding in the coming period. But the idea is that it's kind of looking at the less explored side of the Jordan Response Plan, Jordan Compact, and looking at how that played out. Obviously, there's a lot of work on this that anybody that has looked at the Syria refugee response in the region would have come across. What I'm trying to do here is kind of understand essentially how has this impacted the groups or the vulnerable groups that were not considered in its original drafting. And what I was looking at throughout, so basically the main argument of the piece, you could say, is looking at how did measures for Syrian refugee aid, labor inclusion, development, and so on, fail to include, in some ways, vulnerable groups, and also in other ways, actively exclude those groups. So the main overarching theme we're looking at here is that through the expansion of the humanitarian and development sector in Jordan, while these programs may have touched on more sectors of the economy, specifically labor, the groups that they addressed in the process did not expand accordingly. So obviously, with supporting Syrian refugee labor, this means that you also interact with other migrant laborers in the market, but this change was not necessarily considered in the original drafting. I obviously don't want to spend too much time just on that, but I hope that was an okay kind of cover or a summary of what we're looking at here.
Yes, it absolutely was. So going into more specific refugee legislation, something that you just touched upon, your article discusses in detail the Jordan Response Plan and Jordan Compact in terms of refugee policy. So can you give an overview about what these pieces of legislation are and how these initiatives have impacted both Syrian and non-Syrian refugees?
Okay, so in some ways, so just to give some clarity, it's not totally legislation, they're more like strategies, plans that kind of shaped or had an influence over the way the response plan unfolded in the years after they were drafted. For it to make sense, we have to go back to the context of the drafting. First the JRP, then the Jordan Compact. Obviously, there were responses before then. So this was what I'm talking about is 2015 onwards. The Syrian influx was going on 2012, 2013. So this isn't when we began caring about it in the region, of course, but it was rather when there was a shift. And when you say JRP or Jordan Response Plan kind of in passing, what is referred to is its 2015 iteration. And what that was a plan that was the first attempt, I would say, in the country at bridging the humanitarian development nexus into something implementable, you could say, or operational. And so what that looked at was, for example, looking at medium and long-term funding rather than the emergency response style that had been adopted in the years before. So that was one key difference. I alluded to that, of course, earlier, this development long-term. This is kind of the key difference, is we went from looking at 3-month cash injections to talking about multi-year funding schemes. What that also means, of course, is what happened a couple of months later. So looking at the 2016 Jordan Compact, is that was you could say the actual integration into the economic sphere. So moving away from just humanitarian development kind of planning, but also saying what policy changes can we make? And obviously the clear one for a lot of refugees and what's important for self-reliance, especially, is labor. And what the Jordan Compact was in that sense was, you can call it an agreement, whether it's a law, it's a policy. It's like the word compact is kind of loosely used in a lot of these contexts. So it's just, take that with a grain of salt. But what it loosely was this aid, trade, and labor agreement In summary, essentially, it was supposed to provide Jordan with relaxed terms of trade, albeit not very effectively, but that's a different story, in exchange for supporting and facilitating Syrian refugee labor participation, legal participation. That's a very important distinction. Um, a big part of that, what that happened was kind of like what was sort of referred to on the ground and passing as a Syrian work permit program. Wasn't officially a program necessarily, but it kind of evolved that way. And what that did was obviously issue, what was really talked about was issuance of work permits to Syrian refugees in a number of sectors for reduced or no cost. Obviously, this is a big change at the time. What also followed a number of other changes, things like no sponsorship, which is a big deal in a country like Jordan, which was reliant on sponsorship for foreign labor, and so on. There was a number of changes. A number positive. It's still widely criticized due to issues with accessing social protection and whatnot, and the level of labor that it grants you access to. But a criticism that I'm trying to bring in this piece is the impact on non-Syrian labor, or non-Syrian and non-Jordanian labor. So this segment that's foreign but non-Syrian, in the country, and looking at how this impacted that group, and what you find, basically is looking at the impacts of competition and whatnot, is that it made non-Syrian migrant labor in Jordan comparatively more expensive, and it had an informalization impact on in areas in which Syrians were competing with other foreign labor, namely Egyptians. This is a more cited study that had come out that kind of found this impact. And it also, in the same period, there was more legislation to make it difficult to bring in foreign labor throughout those years, so 2015, 2016 onwards. It became more and more challenging to bring in foreign labor. It became also more expensive to do so, while it was being made easier for a certain group. So there was these kind of things happening at once. And you could argue, and what you could kind of observe, of course, and which was the problem, is that while we had this Syrian refugee labor facilitation, again, I'm not saying that it was effective at all. It's widely criticized. But what was happening simultaneously was a restriction. So it was this kind of attempted replacement, but not necessarily a good one.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. And my final question for you today is, what lessons can the international community learn from Jordan's experience with refugee differentiation? And what are the key takeaways you hope readers will gain after reading your article?
So it's the same for both. I would say the really, really clear thing is what, maybe this is something as specific to, and I put this in quotations, the global South, but countries that host refugees today have tended to be refugee hosts for a while. So Jordan is always cited as a refugee haven, okay, because it's been hosting refugees or migrants from the region for a long time, even before it became a kingdom. So throughout the 20th century and also late 19th. If this is so widely cited and it's widely understood, then it should also follow, of course, that other refugees exist in the country. It does not mean, again, I want to really, really emphasize this. It does not mean that Syrians are by any means living better or living well in Jordan. There's still high poverty rates, still issues with accessing labor market, all of these things. But what I would hope the international community would take from this is that while there is some understanding for these quick responses at the beginning, being nationality focused, earmarking and whatnot, there are these effects that happen later. It's a path dependency that follows. So even now, I support with the One Refugee Approach working group in Jordan. There is a path dependency that happened years later. While there is interest now amongst the international community to maybe include other groups in aid programs, it's almost like it's happening a bit too late in the response, because it's hard to change the structures that we agreed on years ago, because now there is going to be more government resistance to that, for instance, because it is a country with a limited budget and a high unemployment rate, and don't necessarily want to create pull factors. I put that in quotation as well. And so what I'm hoping is that this also creates an understanding that when we say holistic response or comprehensive response, we really do need to mean comprehensive. We do need to think about everyone that is considered or that may be impacted by an influx. We use the word host community in Jordan. It very literally means in practice Jordanian citizen. But there are migrant communities that have been there for decades, even if they've been there for just a year before before the Syrian influx, they were also impacted. Migrant labor that was existing in the labor market were also impacted. These were also host communities, regardless of whether or not they're citizens. But we also go for a convenient definition that is kind of satisfactory for everybody in between. I understand why this happens. I understand the practicalities of it. But of course, it does mean that there are people that are forgotten in the process and could also create intra-group rivalries and issues that are fostered by the fact that we have biased support. And so what I would hope from that planning in the future, because unfortunately, with the way things are going, it will not be the last crisis in the region. Or I would hope it would be, but we don't know. And the way it's been going the past few decades, it does not seem hopeful. I would hope that these are better understood in future planning. And from the way we also approach it as, just people, civil society, communities, even just beyond donors, when you talk about refugees in the community, you must talk about everybody. We say, I think it's convenient for us to say Syrian refugee or Ukrainian refugee, which is now the big trend in Europe. It's convenient to do that because it's easier to categorize people in that way. But the question is easier for whom? And that's not considering who may be marginalized in the process. And I will leave that answer there before I keep going for too long.
Thank you for that answer. That was very informative. This has been a very interesting conversation. Thank you so much for your time, Shaddin, and
Thank you.
and I would like to thank everybody for tuning in. Hello, everyone, and thank you for checking out the IMES-MERIP IMPOP page. Today, we are joined by Kurt Bonz, the Country Director for the International Refugee Assistance Project. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kurt.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. To start us off, can you tell us more about the International Refugee Assistance Project and specifically more about your role and responsibilities as the Country Director?
Absolutely. So at the International Refugee Assistance Project, we believe everyone should have a safe place to call home and a safe way to get there. To achieve this, we aim to get legal knowledge into the hands of those who need it most, and to give them a chance to use the law to open pathways to safety for themselves and their families. So access to legal information and legal services is where we come in. First, IRAP uses technology through a digital platform, through a chatbot and a website, to make these laws and processes more accessible. We give refugees access to timely, accurate, and culturally relevant information about their legal rights and options. IRAP also provides direct legal services both on the ground, as we do in Jordan, as well as remotely in partnership with organizations, law firms, pro bono attorneys, and other trusted legal advocates. While representing our clients, we're then able to identify systemic issues that we then use the law to address and ultimately to change for the better. So IRAP has offices in New York, DC, Amman, Jordan, Beirut, Lebanon, and Berlin, Germany. I'm the country director of IRAP Jordan, and I work closely with our global team to meet the organizational goals while adapting to our work in Jordan to be responsive to the ever-changing kind of programmatic landscape locally. Also to address, and then of course to addressing those evolving needs of our clients, to access those pathways, whether they be through the traditional resettlement involving the UNHCR, which is the United Nations Agency for Refugees, or to directly with resettlement countries. Now, we also seek so-called complementary pathways. These are, for example, access to humanitarian visas directly through embassies and family reunification pathways. So in addition to this programmatic portion, in my role, I'm also the official representative of the organization in country. And to that extent, I'm liaising with government officials, other organizations, stakeholders, communities, etc., as well as overseeing our operations here in Jordan.
So the featured piece on our IMPOP page deals with differential migrant treatment in Jordan. Could you kind of explain what differential treatment of migrant groups means and what that might look like?
Of course, yeah. That I think, kind of backing up a little bit, differential treatment is when the principle of equality is set aside to take into account other considerations. This can be applied in a beneficial manner for middle-income nations that are supporting a significant per capita proportion of refugees in their country. For example, Jordan is the second largest, or supports the second largest population per capita globally of refugees. Now, it helps to manage this differential treatment, helps to manage the economic inequalities in managing a refugee crisis. So in the context of the Syrian refugee crisis, donor countries can then fund the Regional Refugee Resilience Plan, which is a plan that is a strategic coordination, planning, advocacy, and programming platform that includes that investment, it's intended to kind of pull together the needs to respond to the crisis from both a humanitarian and a developmental development perspective. And in this particular, the Syrian refugee crisis regional refugee resilience plan, it's pulling together the needs of, or it's identifying the needs across the region. So that would include Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. And also includes not just the response to the refugee crisis, but then also incorporating the needs of the host communities in those countries by contributing to those national development plans. So that's an example of a beneficial differential treatment that benefits countries that are hosting large refugee populations. But differential treatment can also be applied to immigration policies, getting back to your question specifically, whereby it creates a tiered system, effectively providing some groups with more rights than others. And we see this happening globally. For example, in Poland's prevention of Syrian and Northern African refugees from entering the country, denying 95% of asylum claims in 2020. And then on the other hand, is also very welcoming and receives Ukrainian refugees in significant numbers, who, to be clear, also need protection. But there are similar recent examples, not just in Poland, but throughout the EU and in family reunification cases in the United Kingdom. And then from the US perspective, we've certainly seen that historically in the US and more recently. But the point is, it's also here in Jordan. And to that end, since January of 2019, those seeking refuge who have entered on a tourist visa, a medical visa, employment, or a student visa are then prohibited from applying for international protection as a refugee through UNHCR. So who is this impacting? It's disproportionately affecting minority refugees, such as Yemenis, Sudanese, Somali, and other sub-Saharan African, and individuals from other sub-Saharan African nations. Well, while this is being implemented, January 2019, those entering on those 4 visas are not then permitted to seek refugee status. At this very same time, in early 2019, if one were to enter not through an airport, but instead through an open land border, for example, from Syria, then they were permitted to apply for protection as a refugee through UNHCR. And so this differential treatment, in essence, was prioritizing Syrian refugees over refugees from other countries to enter the country.
Okay. And I'd like to ask, in your opinion, what are the most challenging legal hurdles that minority migrants are currently facing in Jordan?
Yeah, good question. I have a couple of thoughts on that. So I think the first and foremost is the registration. So that issue that we just addressed. The registration for international protection offered by the government of Jordan through identification through UNHCR. So without status, an individual may be asked to leave the country when their visa expires. So for example, if one does not have refugee status, but they only have the visa that they've entered in, let's say they've entered on an education visa. When they've completed their coursework that they're studying, then they'd be asked to leave the country. Or if they entered in an employment visa, if their job is complete, or their employment contract is left to expire, then they're asked to leave the country at the end of that. The same goes for a medical visa. Jordan is very well known for its robust medical or healthcare capacity within the region. And so an individual may have a unique health issue that they cannot be treated in their country of origin. However, it is available in Jordan. And so they would be able to get a health visa travel or a medical visa and travel to Jordan. Once they receive that treatment, then they'd be asked to leave the country. And this is regardless of the risk of persecution that they may face if they return to their country of origin. So registration really is a significant issue for individuals I think one of the most significant legal hurdles. But another, let's consider, so that's registered and unregistered refugees, but let's consider within the refugee population. So people who are registered with UNHCR and the government of Jordan as refugees, they have refugee status in Jordan, they have international protection. There are different programs for people from different nationalities. For example, subsidized freelance work permits are limited by nationality for refugee populations, whereby Yemeni, Sudanese, and Somali refugees are not included. If they seek a work permit, they're asked to give up their international protection to apply for that work permit, risking deportation if they're denied the one-year work permit. Now, if they instead choose to maintain their international protection and seek irregular employment otherwise, then they're vulnerable to arrest, detention, and threat of deportation. So these barriers to accessing employment, illegal employment, that coupled with the fact that there are limits to the social safety net programming that's available to support these populations, this lends to an especially vulnerable kind of population or community. So that's, I think, a second component. But I think going into a little bit further, I'm also reminded of debt mediation. So I think one of the legacies of COVID, as well as war in food staple producing nations, fluctuation in oil prices, all of these elements have impacted globally and led to a higher cost of living. And that's also true in Jordan. And when they're with a higher cost of living and with those challenges, this really kind of impacts those on the edges of financial stability first, and also for the longest period. I think many studies have demonstrated this. So, but the debt has risen significantly over the past several years in Jordan amongst the displaced community or displaced populations, and access to debt mediation programming, which is intended to renegotiate debt and avoid involvement of the police or courts. This can be limited to only those registered as refugees, or even with refugee populations from certain nationalities. So that is an additional kind of legal hurdle or issue. And just to kind of put a little context of, debt can be broad in terms of where debt lies. And I think amongst the non-Syrian population, a significant portion of the population has debt to their landlord. There may be even significant debt to small business owners, those who are providing or sell food staples. And so these are kind of the two kind of largest entities of which people owe debt to. But I think, just as a kind of a point of reference, it's not all challenging news. I think there are also the highlights. So certainly we've had these legal hurdles. There have also been other legal hurdles that have been overcome. That includes access to schools, whereby refugees, minority refugees, were at one stage, it was especially challenging for them to access school for their children. And even when they were able to access school, it was often after a registration period, and matriculation was very challenging. This, as well as access to subsidized medical services, have significantly improved over the past several years. And this, basically how this has come about is really the donor states who are working closely with the government of Jordan have come together to advance the national development goals and improve the access to education and medical services for everyone in Jordan. And I think that's a really kind of interesting kind of highlight to see that once there were kind of legal barriers for access to schools for minority refugees, or access to a subsidized medical service, and then those can be overcome with changes in practice policy and funded programming, ultimately, which again then goes on to benefit everyone in Jordan. So I think that's a really kind of interesting kind of component that is perhaps a roadmap forward as well.
Kind of going off your previous answer, looking more towards the future, what step can international organizations take to promote more equitable treatment of refugees and migrants?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, the rights of all refugees and asylum seekers should be protected without discrimination on the basis of status, nationality, race, etc. Instead, service delivery based upon impartiality and non-discrimination, that protection and assistance should be provided to individuals in need, regardless of their nationality. It's critical to shift to an inclusive, needs-based approach to provide assistance and protection. And I think that organizations, by and large, understand this. However, I would encourage organizations to actively join efforts to prioritize inclusion, an inclusive needs-based approach. I think in addition to that, equally important are also for donors. So the donor nations that support a significant proportion of humanitarian assistance or development. It's really important for donors to also prioritize a needs-based approach. So I think that between whether it be organization, donors, and host country, I think through those three entities coming together, it certainly can. I think we can achieve that goal.
And for my final question, what advice would you give to students who are interested in migrant advocacy work?
Yeah, I think you may have heard it before, but it's get involved. Get involved in local advocacy work. There's a wide variety of organizations and movements that one can become a part of in support of migrant advocacy work. And through my own personal experience, but then also I think that's also kind of reflective of community building. This is start local. Get to know others in your community already working in this space, because there certainly are. Seek to better understand the needs of the migrant communities where you live. In the US, consider reaching out to a local refugee resettlement office if you're interested in working specifically with refugees. There's a network of 300 local affiliates operating in more than 200 communities in 46 states throughout the United States, and they work to help resettle refugees. So to provide assistance, to provide housing, etc., for when refugees first arrive into the U.S. Through the Refugee Resettlement Program. And I think there are obviously many different sponsorship or other programs that one can become a part of. But I think that stepping forward and volunteering, helping to fundraise or otherwise engaging with these organizations, and really kind of focusing on building your own experience and relationships by contributing to the mission. So through those efforts, it may help you to better understand how you'd like to contribute in the longer term. Certainly, IRAP has made the choice of pursuing efforts through the legal system, whether that be representing individuals or pursuing litigation when advocacy efforts have fallen short. But there are many ways that one can contribute to supporting this space in this space. So specific to the United States, go to the Refugee Council USA website. If you're not in the US, if you're outside the US, I should say, then most refugee resettlement countries have a refugee council that centralizes advocacy efforts, whereby you can get plugged in either through a national network, regional network, or local municipality or even state level efforts. And those can be largely found through a simple Google search.
Thank you so much. That's very wonderful advice. And thank you, Kurt, for taking the time to do this interview. And I would like to thank everybody else for tuning in.